The dust swirled across the wooden platform of Colorado City's train station as Josephine Nelson clutched her small valise, her stomach twisting with uncertainty. The May afternoon sun beat down on her pale skin, a stark reminder that she was no longer in the cool embrace of Boston, but in the wild heart of the Colorado Territory. 1876. She watched as the train that had carried her across a continent belched black smoke and slowly pulled away, leaving her alone in a strange land with nothing but a name and an address. Matthew Anderson leaned against the hitching post outside the station, his weathered Stetson pulled low to shield his eyes from the harsh sun. When the station master had sent word that a woman matching the description of his mail-order bride had arrived on the eastbound train, he'd felt a curious mixture of anticipation and dread. 3 months of exchanging letters had culminated in this moment. Yet something felt wrong as he watched the slender figure standing alone on the platform, looking lost and entirely too refined for frontier life. Matthew straightened and approached her slowly, noting the quality of her traveling dress and the nervous way she kept glancing around. "Miss Nelson," he ventured, removing his hat as his mother had taught him when addressing a lady. Josephine turned at the sound of her name, relief flooding her features. "Mr. Anderson." "Matthew Anderson," he nodded, studying her face. She was prettier than he had expected, with warm brown eyes and chestnut hair tucked neatly beneath a modest bonnet. But there was something in her expression, confusion, perhaps even fear, that gave him pause. "I'm pleased to meet you at last," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I apologize for any delay. The journey was longer than I anticipated." Matthew took her hand briefly. "No need to apologize. My ranch is about an hour's ride from town. I've brought the wagon." He gestured toward a sturdy farm wagon hitched to 2 solid draft horses. As he helped her into the wagon and secured her valise, a troubling thought nagged at him. "Did you bring the rest of your belongings on a different train?" Josephine's cheeks flushed. "This is all I have, Mr. Anderson." Matthew frowned. "Most mail-order brides arrived with trunks of household linens, clothes, and keepsakes." "I see," he said, though he didn't. Something wasn't right. He climbed up beside her and took the reins. "I'm curious about something, Miss Nelson. The letter you sent describing your arrival." Josephine's hands twisted in her lap. "Mr. Anderson, I must confess something. I did not send any letter." Matthew pulled the horses to a halt before they'd even left the station yard. "No letter. But how did you know where to find me? How did you know to come to Colorado City?" Tears welled in Josephine's eyes. "I was given your name and the location of Colorado City. That is all I have." A cold feeling settled in Matthew's stomach. "Miss Nelson, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was expecting a bride, yes, but a woman named Catherine Parker from Philadelphia. We've been corresponding for months." "Catherine Parker." Josephine's voice was barely audible. "I don't understand." Matthew ran a hand through his hair, mind racing. "Neither do I." He glanced at the train, now just a distant plume of smoke on the horizon. "Perhaps you were meant for another man in town." "I don't know," she whispered, and for the first time Matthew saw real fear in her eyes. He sighed deeply. "Let's get you to town. We'll sort this out." But inquiries at the Colorado City post office and telegraph office yielded nothing. No one was expecting a bride named Josephine Nelson. By late afternoon, Matthew found himself sitting across from the distraught woman at the town's only decent hotel, watching as she fought to maintain her composure. "You have nowhere to go," he stated flatly. "It appears not," she replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the circumstances. "I have some money saved. I can perhaps find employment as what? A school teacher. The town already has one. A seamstress. Mrs. Miller handles most of the town's sewing needs. "This isn't Boston, Miss Nelson." She straightened her spine. "I am aware of that, Mr. Anderson. Nevertheless, I cannot impose upon your kindness any further." Matthew drummed his fingers on the table. The situation was impossible. He couldn't simply abandon her, yet he had no obligation to her either. His ranch needed a wife, a partner, not another burden. Catherine Parker had claimed to be practical, hardworking, and familiar with farm life. This woman looked like she'd never churned butter or collected eggs in her life. And yet there was something about her, a quiet dignity, despite her obvious distress, that he couldn't ignore. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather-bound journal, pushing it across the table toward her. "Tell me everything," he said quietly. Josephine stared at the journal. "I beg your pardon." "Write it all down. Who you are, why you're here, how you came to have my name and address." "Everything." He stood. "I've paid for your room tonight. I'll return tomorrow morning. If I'm to help you, I need to know the truth." Her fingers closed around the journal. "And if you don't like what you read—" Matthew set his hat back on his head. "Then at least we both know where we stand." He left her there, the untouched journal lying between her slender hands, and walked out into the dusty street, his mind a whirl of confusion and unexpected concern for a woman who had arrived from nowhere, bearing nothing but his name. Josephine stared at the closed door long after Matthew Anderson had departed. Her fingers trembled as she opened the journal, its blank pages an accusation. How could she possibly explain what had happened without sounding like a madwoman or worse, a liar? Taking a deep breath, she dipped the hotel pen into the inkwell and began to write. "My name is Josephine Elizabeth Nelson. I was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1854 to Thomas and Margaret Nelson." She wrote until her hand cramped, filling page after page with the story of her life. Her father's shipping business. Her mother's death from consumption when Josephine was 16. The years spent keeping her father's house and watching her prospects for marriage diminish with each passing season. Then her father's sudden death last winter, leaving behind not the fortune they had lived on, but a mountain of debt that swallowed everything they owned. "I was desperate," she wrote. "My cousin in New York offered me shelter, but I knew I would be little more than an unpaid servant in her household. That was when I saw the advertisement in the newspaper. Seeking bride for established rancher in Colorado Territory, must be of good character and willing to work." It was placed by a matrimonial agency in Chicago. Her pen hesitated over the page as she recalled what happened next. The journey to Chicago. The cramped office where a thin, rat-faced man named Simmons had taken her money and promised to match her with a suitable husband. "He showed me your letters, or what I believed to be your letters. They described a prosperous cattle ranch in Colorado Territory, a comfortable home, and a man of 32 years seeking a companion for his solitary life. The letters were signed Matthew Anderson, and they were eloquent and kind. I was given your name and the location of Colorado City, and told that you were expecting me on the May 12th train." She paused, ink dripping from her pen as she remembered the sickening moment when she realized something was terribly wrong. The way Matthew's face had changed when he realized she had no letter of introduction. The dawning horror that she had been deceived. "I believe now that Mr. Simmons was a fraud. That he took my money, all that remained of my inheritance after my father's debts were paid, and sent me west on a false promise. Perhaps he does this to many desperate women. I cannot say. I know only that I have arrived at your doorstep with nothing to offer but the truth of my circumstance. I am alone in the world, Mr. Anderson, with no family and no means to return east. I understand that this is not your concern, and I will seek employment in Colorado City if you can direct me to suitable opportunities." She hesitated, then added, "I am educated. I can read and write. I keep excellent accounts. I play the piano tolerably well, though I doubt that is of much use in Colorado territory. I have managed a household of servants, though I confess I have never done the work myself. But I am willing to learn whatever is necessary to make my way in this new place. I ask not for charity, but for guidance in finding my path forward. As the light faded from the window, Josephine signed her name at the bottom of the final page and closed the journal. She had told him everything, perhaps more than was wise. Now her fate rested in the hands of a stranger whose life she had unwittingly disrupted. She slept poorly that night, dreams filled with endless train journeys and the mocking face of Mr. Simmons, counting her money as she disappeared into the western wilderness. Morning came too quickly. Josephine washed her face with the cold water provided in the room's basin, dressed in her second-best traveling outfit, and waited. At precisely 8 o'clock, a knock sounded at her door. Matthew Anderson stood in the hallway, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he extended his hand for the journal. "I've written everything," she said, passing it to him, "though I fear it does not paint me in a favorable light." "Wait here," he said gruffly, tucking the journal under his arm. "I'll be back." An hour passed before Matthew returned. He found Josephine sitting by the window, her small valise packed and ready beside her. "I've read your account," he said without preamble. "This man Simmons, you paid him a considerable sum." "Everything I had," she admitted. "Almost $100, Matthew whistled low. "A small fortune. And he's done this before, if my suspicions are correct. Last month, a woman arrived in Pueblo looking for a husband who didn't exist. Month before that, same thing happened in Trinidad." Josephine's heart sank. "Then I am not the first fool." "Not a fool," Matthew corrected. "Desperate, perhaps. But not a fool." He paced the small room. "I've spoken with Sheriff Jenkins. He's going to send telegrams to other towns, see if we can build a case against this Simmons character. But that doesn't solve your immediate problem." "No," she agreed softly. "It doesn't." Matthew stopped pacing and faced her directly. "I have a proposition, Miss Nelson." Josephine tensed. She had heard such words before, usually followed by suggestions that would compromise her virtue. As if reading her thoughts, Matthew quickly added, "A business arrangement, nothing more. My ranch needs help. I need a housekeeper, someone to cook, clean, and keep the place in order while I work the cattle. I can't offer much in the way of wages, but you'd have room and board and time to decide what you want to do next." Josephine studied him carefully. Matthew Anderson was not what she had pictured from the fraudulent letters. He was younger than 32. She guessed perhaps no more than 28. His face was tanned from the sun, with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting across open ranges. His hands were calloused, his clothes practical rather than fashionable. But his eyes were kind, and there was an honesty in his manner that reassured her. "What of your expected bride, Catherine Parker?" A shadow crossed his face. "I received a telegram this morning. She's married a banker in Denver, never planned to come to Colorado City at all." "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. He shrugged. "Seems we've both been deceived. So what do you say? It's not what either of us planned, but it might be a solution for now." Josephine considered her options, which were admittedly few. Stay in town and try to find work. With what references? Return east. With what money? At least on Matthew's ranch she would have shelter and food while she determined her next steps. "I accept your offer, Mr. Anderson. Though I must warn you, I have never been a housekeeper before. My family had servants." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I figured as much from your account. Don't worry. Ranch life isn't complicated, just hard work. You'll learn." And so Josephine Nelson found herself once again in Matthew Anderson's wagon, heading away from Colorado City toward an uncertain future on a cattle ranch in the shadow of Pikes Peak. The journey to Matthew's ranch took them through rolling grasslands that stretched to the horizon, broken occasionally by stands of pine and aspen. To the west, the Rocky Mountains rose majestically, their snow-capped peaks gleaming in the morning sun. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that stirred something unexpected in Josephine's heart. "How far does your land extend?" she asked, trying to imagine the boundaries of the prosperous cattle ranch she'd been promised. "About 500 acres," Matthew replied. "Not as big as some spreads, but enough for my herd. Good water access, decent grazing. The house isn't much, just 4 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, but it's solid. My father built it 20 years ago before the war." "You were raised here," Matthew nodded. "Born and bred." Pa came west in '52 during the gold rush, met Ma in Denver. They settled here to raise cattle instead of chasing dreams in the mountains. Smarter move in the end. Lot of men died broke looking for gold. "And your parents now," she ventured. "Gone. Pa took a fever 5 years back." Ma followed him a year later. "Some say from a broken heart, but I think it was the consumption." He glanced at her. "Been running the place alone since then." Josephine absorbed this information. So Matthew had been alone for 4 years, managing everything himself. No wonder he had sought a mail-order bride. The isolation must be overwhelming at times. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly. "I understand the pain of losing parents." He acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod. "Your account mentioned your mother died when you were young and your father recently." "Yes. Mother when I was 16, father just this past winter. It's been difficult." They fell into companionable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts as the wagon rolled across the prairie. It was mid-afternoon when Matthew pointed to a cluster of buildings nestled against a hillside. "There it is. Anderson Ranch." Josephine leaned forward, taking in her first glimpse of what would be her temporary home. The main house was a sturdy log structure with a stone chimney, smaller than she had imagined but well maintained. A barn stood nearby, along with a corral and several outbuildings. A creek wound its way past the property, lined with cottonwood trees that provided welcome shade. In the distance, cattle grazed on the open range. It was modest, far from the grand estate described in the fraudulent letters, but there was something honest and appealing about its simplicity. As they drew closer, a large dog bounded from the porch, barking enthusiastically. Josephine instinctively recoiled. "That's just Rusty," Matthew assured her. "Good cattle dog. Won't harm you unless you're trying to steal my livestock." The wagon pulled up to the house, and Matthew jumped down, immediately moving to help Josephine descend. His hands were strong at her waist, lifting her easily to the ground. The brief contact sent an unexpected flutter through her stomach, which she quickly dismissed as nerves. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you around." The interior of the house was clean but sparse. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a stone fireplace, a solid table with 4 chairs, and 2 worn but comfortable-looking armchairs. A bookshelf along one wall held an impressive collection of books, which surprised Josephine. Matthew noticed her interest. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married Pa. She made sure I had books growing up." The kitchen was a lean-to addition at the back of the house, equipped with a cast-iron stove, a pump for water, and various cooking implements hanging from hooks. A small pantry held basic supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, and preserved goods. 2 bedrooms occupied the other side of the house, separated by a narrow hallway. Matthew showed her to the smaller one, which contained a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a washstand. "This was my room growing up," he explained. My parents' room is across the hall. I've been using it since they passed. Josephine set her valise on the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of her situation. She was alone in the wilderness with a man she had just met, dependent entirely on his goodwill. What had she gotten herself into? As if sensing her distress, Matthew stepped back. "I'll give you some time to settle in. I need to check on the cattle anyway. The kitchen is stocked enough for a simple supper. Don't worry about cooking tonight if you're too tired." After he left, Josephine sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself a moment of weakness. Tears slid down her cheeks as she thought of how far she had fallen from the daughter of a Boston merchant to a housekeeper on a remote cattle ranch. Yet even as she cried, a stubborn streak of determination took hold. This was not the end of her story, merely a difficult chapter. She would endure, learn, and eventually find her way to a better situation. Wiping her tears, Josephine unpacked her meager belongings. 3 dresses, undergarments, a nightgown, a hairbrush, and a small framed photograph of her parents on their wedding day. She placed the photograph on the chest of drawers, a small piece of home in this strange new place. Then she rolled up her sleeves and went to explore the kitchen. If she was to be a housekeeper, she might as well begin learning her duties. Matthew returned at dusk to find Josephine standing uncertainly by the stove, a pot of what appeared to be stew bubbling on the surface. The smell was peculiar. "I found potatoes and salt pork in the pantry," she explained, a flush rising to her cheeks, "and some dried beans. I'm afraid I've never actually prepared a meal before, but I watched our cook occasionally." Matthew approached the stove cautiously and peered into the pot. The contents were an unappetizing gray color, with chunks of barely cooked potato and beans floating in watery liquid. He took a tentative spoonful and immediately regretted it. The pork was still half raw, the beans hard as pebbles, and she'd apparently mistaken salt for sugar, making the concoction nearly inedible. To his credit, Matthew swallowed the bite without comment. "It's a good first attempt," he managed, "but perhaps we should start with something simpler tomorrow. Tonight I'll show you how to fry up some bacon and make cornbread." Relief washed over Josephine's face. "I would appreciate that. Clearly I have much to learn." Together, they emptied the failed stew and started fresh. Matthew patiently demonstrated how to slice the bacon properly, how hot the skillet needed to be, and how to mix the cornbread batter. Josephine watched intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. "My mother always said cooking is just following directions," Matthew said as he poured the batter into a greased pan. "Same as anything else. You'll get the hang of it." They ate their simple meal at the kitchen table, and Josephine found herself relaxing slightly as Matthew shared stories about the ranch and the surrounding area. He spoke with genuine passion about his cattle, the land, and his hopes for expanding his herd in the coming years. There was nothing of the refined gentleman she had imagined from the false letters, but there was an earnestness to him that was appealing in its own way. "Tomorrow I'll show you the basic chores," Matthew said as they washed the dishes together. "Nothing too difficult to start feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, maybe churning butter if we have enough cream." "I'll do my best to learn quickly," Josephine promised. "I don't wish to be a burden." Matthew gave her a considering look. "You know, Miss Nelson, I've been thinking about your situation. That man Simmons took advantage of your vulnerable position. It's not right." "No," she agreed softly, "it's not. But dwelling on it won't change what happened. Maybe not, but justice might ease the sting." He dried his hands on a towel. "I'm heading into town day after tomorrow. Sheriff Jenkins might have heard back about those telegrams by then. Would you like to come along?" The invitation surprised her. "Yes, I would, thank you." They bid each other good night soon after, and Josephine retreated to her small bedroom. Despite the strange surroundings and uncertain future, exhaustion claimed her quickly. She fell asleep to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie night, the distant lowing of cattle, the chirping of crickets, and the soft hooting of an owl. The following days established a pattern that would define Josephine's life at Anderson Ranch. Each morning, she rose with the sun to help Matthew with breakfast, gradually taking over more of the preparation as her skills improved. After eating, Matthew would head out to work with his cattle while Josephine tackled her household duties. Those first weeks were humbling. She struggled with the most basic tasks: building a fire in the stove without smoking up the house, washing clothes in the heavy iron tub, sweeping the seemingly endless dust that crept in through every crack. Her hands, once soft and unblemished, became reddened and rough. Her elegant dresses proved entirely unsuitable for ranch work. So Matthew brought her some of his mother's old clothes from a trunk in the attic, practical cotton dresses and aprons that Josephine altered to fit her slighter frame. Their trip to town yielded disappointing news. Sheriff Jenkins had received responses to his telegrams, confirming that several women across Colorado and Wyoming had been victimized by someone matching Simmons' description, but the man himself had vanished. The Chicago address Josephine had been given turned out to be an abandoned storefront. "He's likely moved on to another city, another name," the sheriff explained sympathetically. "These confidence men rarely stay in one place long enough to be caught." Josephine had nodded, accepting the reality that she would never recover her money or see justice served. On the wagon ride back to the ranch, she had been quiet, processing the finality of her situation. "What will you do now?" Matthew had asked. "Continue working for you if you'll have me," she replied. "At least until I can save enough for a train ticket east." He'd nodded, and they'd spoken little the rest of the journey. But something had shifted between them after that day, a shared understanding that Josephine's stay was temporary, that their arrangement was merely a convenient solution to mutual problems. June brought warmer weather and new challenges. Matthew taught Josephine how to care for the vegetable garden his mother had established years ago, now somewhat overgrown but still productive. She learned to identify which plants were weeds and which were the precious vegetables that would sustain them through the winter. The work was backbreaking at times, but there was satisfaction in watching the garden slowly transform under her care. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they often sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. Sometimes, Matthew would read aloud from one of his books, Dickens or Twain or Shakespeare, his deep voice bringing the words to life in a way that transported Josephine far from the isolated ranch. Other nights, they simply talked, sharing stories of their vastly different upbringings and discovering surprising common ground in their love of literature and music. It was during one such evening in late June that Josephine first noticed a change in how she perceived Matthew. He was describing his first cattle drive as a boy of 14, gesturing expressively as he recounted the adventure. The setting sun gilded his features, highlighting the strength in his jaw and the warmth in his eyes when he laughed. A peculiar tightness gripped her chest, and she found herself watching his hands, those capable, calloused hands that could gentle a frightened calf or repair a broken fence with equal skill. Startled by her own thoughts, Josephine excused herself early that night, blaming fatigue from a day spent canning preserves. But sleep eluded her as she lay in bed, trying to make sense of her confused emotions. Matthew was her employer, nothing more. In a few months, she would have saved enough to return east. Developing any sort of attachment would be foolish. Yet as June melted into July, such feelings became increasingly difficult to ignore. Matthew, too, seemed to be struggling with something unspoken. She would catch him watching her sometimes with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. He began finding reasons to return to the house during the day to fetch a tool he'd forgotten, to check if she needed anything from town, to bring her wildflowers he claimed were crowding the north pasture and needed to be cleared. Independence Day brought a welcome diversion. The residents of Colorado City planned a celebration with fireworks, contests, and a dance. Matthew suggested they attend, and Josephine agreed eagerly, longing for a change of scenery and the company of other women. The morning of the 4th dawned clear and hot. Josephine wore her best dress, a blue cotton that she had carefully mended and adorned with fresh lace collar and cuffs. When Matthew saw her waiting on the porch, he stopped in his tracks, his expression momentarily unguarded. "You look very nice," he said, the compliment awkward but sincere. "Thank you," she replied, suddenly shy. "You look quite handsome yourself." It was true. Matthew had traded his work clothes for a clean shirt and vest, and had even trimmed his beard for the occasion. The town square was festively decorated with bunting and flags when they arrived. Children ran about waving small flags, women gathered in groups sharing gossip and recipes, and men clustered around contests of strength and skill. Josephine was quickly adopted by a group of ranchers' wives who had been curious about the woman staying at Anderson Ranch. Their initial skepticism gave way to genuine warmth as Josephine shared an edited version of her circumstances. "Mail-order bride scams are more common than folks realize," said Mrs. Peterson, a motherly woman whose husband ran the general store. "You're lucky Matthew found you instead of some unsavory character." "Yes," Josephine agreed, watching as Matthew competed in a horseshoe-tossing contest across the square. "I am fortunate. He's a good man," Mrs. Peterson continued. "Works hard, honest to a fault. Been alone too long, if you ask me. That Catherine Parker would have been lucky to have him." Josephine murmured agreement, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. She was saved from further comment by the announcement that the dancing would begin. The town hall had been cleared of furniture, and a small band of local musicians struck up a lively tune. Couples formed sets for a Virginia reel, and to Josephine's surprise, Matthew appeared at her side, offering his hand. "Would you care to dance, Miss Nelson?" She hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. "I would be delighted, Mr. Anderson." Matthew proved to be a capable dancer, moving with the natural grace of a man comfortable in his body. As they progressed through the figures of the dance, their hands meeting and parting, Josephine found herself laughing with genuine pleasure for the first time in months. When the music shifted to a waltz, Matthew's hand settled at her waist, and he guided her smoothly around the floor. "I didn't expect you to dance so well," she admitted. He smiled, the rare expression transforming his face. "My mother insisted I learn, said no son of hers would stomp around a dance floor like a wounded buffalo." Josephine laughed. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. "You remind me of her sometimes, not in appearance, but in spirit. She had your determination." The comparison pleased her more than it should have. As they continued to dance, Josephine became increasingly aware of Matthew's physical presence, the solid strength of his shoulder beneath her hand, the clean scent of soap and sunshine that clung to him, the way his eyes never left her face. When the dance ended, neither moved immediately to break apart. For a breathless moment, Josephine thought he might say something significant, but the spell was broken by the mayor announcing the fireworks would begin shortly. They joined the crowd moving toward the edge of town where the display would be visible. Matthew spread a blanket on a small rise, and they sat side by side watching as the first rockets screamed into the night sky, bursting into cascades of red, white, and blue stars. "It's beautiful," Josephine breathed, tilting her head back to take in the spectacle. "Yes," Matthew agreed, though when she glanced at him, she found he was looking not at the sky but at her. The heat that rose to her cheeks had nothing to do with the July evening. Something was changing between them, something neither had anticipated when she first arrived at his door without a letter. But what future could there be for a Boston merchant's daughter and a Colorado cattle rancher? Their worlds were too different, their expectations of life incompatible. Weren't they? The journey back to the ranch was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Matthew helped Josephine down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "I had a wonderful time today," she said softly. "Thank you for suggesting it." "My pleasure." He hesitated, then added, "Josephine, whatever he had been about to say was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. They turned to see a rider coming hard down the road toward the ranch, his horse lathered with exertion. "Matthew," the man called as he drew closer. "Got trouble? Jenkins sent me to fetch you. Rustlers hit the Carson place last night. They're organizing a posse to track them." Matthew's expression hardened. "Rustlers? Anyone hurt?" "Old man Carson took a bullet in the shoulder. He'll live, but they made off with near 30 head of prime stock." The rider, whom Josephine now recognized as one of the men from town, glanced at her apologetically. "Pardon, madam. No apology needed," she assured him. Matthew was already moving toward the house. "Tell Jenkins I'll be there in 20 minutes. Need to get my rifle and extra ammunition." As the rider galloped away, Matthew turned to Josephine. "I have to go. Cattle rustling affects all of us ranchers. If they hit Carson, any of us could be next." "I understand," she said, though fear clutched at her heart. She had heard stories of the violent confrontations between ranchers and rustlers. "Please be careful." He nodded grimly. "Keep the doors locked. Rusty will stay with you. I don't know how long I'll be gone, could be a day or more if we have to track them into the mountains." Josephine followed him into the house, helping him gather what he needed: food, water, ammunition. Her hands trembled slightly as she packed biscuits and jerky into a saddlebag. Just before he mounted his horse, Matthew turned to her, his expression conflicted. "What I was going to say earlier. It can wait until I return. We have things to discuss." And then he was gone, riding hard toward town, leaving Josephine standing in the yard with only Rusty for company and a knot of worry in her stomach that would not ease. The hours following Matthew's departure stretched endlessly. Josephine tried to occupy herself with household tasks, but her mind kept conjuring images of Matthew facing armed rustlers in some remote mountain pass. What if he was injured? What if he didn't return? The thought brought an ache to her chest that surprised her with its intensity. She had not intended to care for Matthew Anderson. He was meant to be a temporary employer, nothing more. Yet somehow, in the weeks she had spent at his ranch, he had become important to her. His quiet strength, his unexpected kindness, his passion for the land he tended, all had worked their way into her heart when she wasn't looking. Night fell, and Josephine reluctantly retired to her bedroom, though she knew sleep would be elusive. Rusty lay across her doorway, his presence reassuring as the wind moaned around the eaves of the house. Outside her window, the vast Colorado sky glittered with stars, and Josephine found herself praying to whatever power might be listening that Matthew would return safely. Morning came with no news. Josephine went through her chores mechanically, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, watering the garden. The day stretched into evening and still no word. She made herself eat a small supper, aware that neglecting her health wouldn't help Matthew. She was washing the dishes when Rusty suddenly leapt to his feet, ears pricked forward. A moment later, Josephine heard it 2 hoofbeats approaching the house. She dried her hands hastily on her apron and hurried to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Relief flooded her at the sight of Matthew dismounting from his horse, whole and apparently uninjured. But as he came closer, she saw the exhaustion etched in his features and the grim set of his mouth. "You're back," she breathed, stepping out onto the porch. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head, leading his tired horse toward the barn. "Just worn out. Been in the saddle almost 2 days straight." Josephine followed him to the barn, waiting as he unsaddled his horse and rubbed the animal down. "Did you find the rustlers?" "Found them," Matthew confirmed, his voice hard. "Up in the foothills near the territorial line. They put up a fight." He paused, then added quietly, "2 of them won't be stealing cattle again." The implications of his words hung in the air between them. Matthew had been part of a deadly confrontation, perhaps had even taken a life himself. It was a harsh reminder of the realities of the frontier, so different from the civilized world she had known in Boston. "Are all of the posse safe?" she asked. "One man took a bullet in the leg. Doc Williams is tending to him in town. The rest of us came through all right." Matthew finished with his horse and turned to face her, his features softened by the lantern light. "I'm sorry if you were worried." "Of course I was worried," she admitted. I care what happens to you, Matthew." Something flickered in his eyes at her words. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the stubble on his jaw and smell the dust of the trail on his clothes. "Do you?" he asked softly. "Because what I wanted to tell you before I left, what I've been trying to find the courage to say for weeks now, is that I care what happens to you too, Josephine, more than I expected to, more than might be wise given our arrangement." Her breath caught in her throat. "Matthew, let me finish," he said gently. "I know you plan to return east when you've saved enough money. I know this life isn't what you imagined for yourself, but these past weeks, watching you adapt, seeing your determination, I've come to admire you greatly, more than admire." He took a deep breath. "I find myself wishing you might consider staying, not as my housekeeper but as my wife." Josephine stared at him, stunned by the directness of his proposal. "Your wife? I know it's sudden," he continued hurriedly, "and I'm not asking for an answer right now. Just think about it, please." Before she could respond, he brushed past her and headed toward the house, leaving Josephine standing in the barn with her thoughts in turmoil. Matthew avoided her the following day, rising before dawn and staying out with his cattle until after dark. Josephine understood he was giving her space to consider his proposal, but his absence only made her confusion greater. She needed to talk to him, to understand what had prompted this sudden declaration. When he finally returned to the house the second evening, she was waiting for him on the porch, determined to have the conversation they both needed. "You've been avoiding me," she said as he approached. Matthew sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "Thought you might want time to think without me hovering." "What I want is to understand what you're offering," Josephine replied. "Is this proposal born of genuine feeling or practical necessity? You needed a wife when you sent for Catherine Parker. Is that all this is, settling for what's available?" The question clearly stung him. "Is that what you think of me? That I'd marry any woman who happened to be under my roof?" "I don't know what to think," she admitted. 3 months ago I was in Boston. 2 months ago I arrived at your door by mistake. And now you're proposing marriage. It's rather a whirlwind, wouldn't you agree?" Matthew sat heavily on the porch steps. "Fair point. But life out here moves differently than in the city. People make decisions more quickly because they have to." He looked up at her, his expression earnest. "I didn't plan to develop feelings for you, Josephine. It happened gradually and then all at once. That day in town, watching you laugh during the dance, I realized I didn't want you to leave." Josephine sat beside him, careful to maintain a proper distance. Marriage is a serious commitment, especially out here where divorce is nearly impossible and society so isolated. We should be certain. I am certain, he said quietly, but I understand if you're not. This isn't the life you expected. She gazed out at the land stretching before them, bathed in the golden light of sunset. It was beautiful in its wild way, so different from the manicured gardens and crowded streets of Boston. In the months she had been here, she had come to appreciate its harsh beauty, its honesty, just as she had come to appreciate the man beside her. I care for you, Matthew, she admitted. More than I expected to. But marriage, I need more time. He nodded, accepting her answer without argument. Time you shall have. My proposal stands whenever you're ready to consider it. The conversation eased the tension between them, allowing them to fall back into their comfortable routine. July faded into August, bringing hotter days and the beginning of harvest season. Josephine found herself increasingly busy preserving vegetables from the garden, making jams from wild berries Matthew brought her, and preparing for the coming winter. Throughout these weeks, Matthew was patient, never pressing her for an answer. But Josephine caught him watching her sometimes with a tenderness that made her heart race, and she found herself watching him too, admiring his strength as he chopped wood for the winter, his gentleness with a newborn calf, his quiet concentration as he read by lamplight in the evenings. She was falling in love with him. The realization came to her one warm August afternoon as she hung laundry on the line, watching Matthew mend a fence in the distance. It wasn't a sudden epiphany, but a quiet acknowledgement of what her heart already knew, yet still she hesitated. Could she truly adapt to this life permanently? Would she grow to resent the isolation, the endless work, the distance from civilization? Or would she find fulfillment in building a life with this good, honest man who had opened his home to her when she had nowhere else to go? The answer came from an unexpected quarter. In late August, a letter arrived from her cousin in New York, the first communication Josephine had received since leaving the East. Matthew brought it from town, handing it to her with an unreadable expression. Came by yesterday's post, he said. Forwarded from Boston, it seems. Josephine took the letter with trembling hands. Had her cousin somehow discovered her whereabouts? Was this an offer of help, a way back to her old life? The letter was brief and to the point. Her cousin had heard of her unfortunate circumstances and offered her a position as companion to her aging mother-in-law. The pay would be minimal, but she would have room and board in their New York home. It's the best I can offer a relative in your reduced circumstances, her cousin wrote. Do let me know if you wish to accept this generous opportunity. Josephine read the letter twice, then set it aside, a strange calm settling over her. Here was her chance to return east, not to the life of privilege she had known, but to something closer to civilization than a cattle ranch in Colorado territory. Yet the prospect brought no joy, only a hollow feeling in the pit of her stomach. She found Matthew in the barn, repairing a saddle. He looked up as she entered, his expression guarded. My cousin has offered me a position in New York, she said without preamble, as companion to an elderly relative. Matthew's hand stilled on the saddle. I see. When would you leave? I haven't decided to accept, she clarified. I wanted to talk to you first. He set the saddle aside and stood, wiping his hands on a rag. What is there to talk about? If you want to go back east, I won't stand in your way. I told you that from the beginning. That's not. Josephine took a deep breath. I'm not asking for your permission, Matthew. I'm trying to tell you that I don't want to go. He went very still. You don't, she shook her head. The position my cousin offers is little better than servitude, but even if it were more appealing, I find I have no desire to return east. My life is here now." She stepped closer to him. "With you, if your offer still stands." For a moment, Matthew said nothing, and Josephine feared she had misunderstood, that his feelings had changed. Then he closed the distance between them in 2 strides and took her hands in his. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "This life isn't easy, Josephine. The winters are harsh, the work never ending. There will be good years and bad years with the cattle. I can't offer you luxury or society or any of the things you grew up with." "I've had luxury," she replied softly. "I've had society. What I haven't had is someone who sees me for who I am, not what I can bring to a marriage. Someone who values my determination and forgives my mistakes. Someone who makes me feel that I belong exactly as I am." She squeezed his hands. "Until now." The joy that bloomed on Matthew's face was answer enough, but his next actions left no doubt of his feelings. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. When they finally broke apart, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Josephine Nelson. Have almost from the moment you stepped off that train without a letter." She smiled up at him, her heart full to bursting. "And I love you, Matthew Anderson, despite all odds and against all reason." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Colorado City, with the townspeople who had come to know and respect them as witnesses. Mrs. Peterson cried openly during the ceremony, later telling anyone who would listen that it was the most romantic thing she'd ever witnessed, a mail-order bride, meant for another man finding true love with the rancher who took her in. Josephine wore a new dress of pale blue calico, purchased with her savings that had been intended for a train ticket east. Matthew wore his Sunday best and a smile that didn't fade all day. Sheriff Jenkins gave the bride away, and afterward declared that he was putting out new telegrams about the con man Simmons, determined that justice would eventually be served. But as the newlyweds drove back to their ranch that evening, justice for Simmons seemed far less important than the future stretching before them. The setting sun painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, and Josephine leaned against her husband's shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible when she stepped off that train 4 months earlier. "No regrets?" Matthew asked softly, his arm secure around her waist. "None," she assured him. "Though I do wonder sometimes, what if I had arrived with a letter? What if everything had happened as it was supposed to?" Matthew considered this. "Then I'd never have given you that journal. You'd never have told me your story. We might have gone through the motions of a practical marriage without ever discovering what was truly between us." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Sometimes mistakes are the best thing that can happen to a person." Josephine smiled, thinking of the journey that had brought her here, from desperate decision to fraudulent promise to unexpected love. "In that case, I'm very glad I arrived without a letter." The years that followed proved the wisdom of Josephine's choice. Life on Anderson Ranch was indeed difficult at times. The winter of 1877 brought blizzards that threatened their cattle herd. The summer of 1878 saw a drought that withered crops and lowered the creek to a trickle. And the financial panic of 1879 drove beef prices so low that they barely broke even that year. But there were joys too: the birth of their first child, a son they named James, in the spring of 1878. The expansion of their herd and their land holdings as neighboring ranches sold out and moved on. The gradual improvements to the house, including a proper kitchen that Matthew built with his own hands as a gift for Josephine's 25th birthday. And always, there was the bond between them, forged in unlikely circumstances and strengthened by shared challenges. Each evening, no matter how exhausting the day had been, they would sit together on the porch watching the sunset, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying each other's presence. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Matthew presented Josephine with a gift, the journal he had given her that first day, now filled with 5 years of memories recorded in her neat handwriting. "I thought you might want to continue the story," he said, handing her a new, empty journal bound in soft leather. "We have many more chapters ahead." Josephine accepted the gift with tears in her eyes, thinking of how far they had come from that first uncertain meeting at the train station. "I'll start tonight," she promised. And she did, beginning the new journal with words that encapsulated their extraordinary journey. "I arrived without a letter, a bride meant for another man. He handed me a journal and said, 'Tell me everything.' I did, and in doing so found not just a home, but my heart's true destination." In the autumn of 1886, a decade after Josephine stepped off the train in Colorado City, the Anderson Ranch hosted a celebration. Their modest home had grown over the years, a second story added, a proper parlor built, a wide veranda wrapping around 3 sides of the house. The barn was larger, the herds more numerous, and the garden Josephine tended now included fruit trees beginning to bear. Friends from town and neighboring ranches gathered to celebrate Matthew's 40th birthday, bringing food and drink and good cheer. Among the guests was Sheriff Jenkins, now retired but still a regular visitor to the Anderson home. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, Jenkins pulled Matthew and Josephine aside. "Got some news you might be interested in," he said, his voice low. "Remember that fellow Simmons, the one who sent Josephine here on false pretenses?" Josephine felt Matthew's hand tighten around hers. "We remember," Matthew said. "Well, seems he finally got what was coming to him. Telegram came through last week from Chicago. He was arrested trying the same scheme on a group of women there. One of them had a brother in law enforcement. They're saying he swindled at least 50 women across the territories and states." "Good," Matthew said firmly. "Hope they lock him up for a long while." Jenkins nodded. 20 years, according to the telegram, and they're trying to locate his victims, return what money they can recover. Josephine shook her head, smiling softly. "They needn't trouble themselves on my account. That $100 was the best investment I ever made, though I didn't know it at the time." After Jenkins left, Matthew and Josephine stood on their veranda, watching as their 3 children, James, now 8, Elizabeth, 6, and little Thomas, just 3, played with the other ranch children in the yard. "You ever wonder," Matthew asked, "what became of Catherine Parker?" "The bride who was actually supposed to come here." Josephine leaned against his shoulder, comfortable in the familiarity of his embrace. "Mrs. Peterson told me she heard Catherine's banker husband lost everything in '79. They moved back east to live with her family." Matthew mused. "I suppose I should thank her someday for choosing that banker. Best disappointment of my life. And I should thank Mr. Simmons for his dishonesty," Josephine laughed. "Though I doubt either of them would appreciate our gratitude." As twilight descended over the ranch, painting the sky in strokes of pink and gold, their guests departed one by one until only family remained. James and Elizabeth begged for a story before bed, and the family gathered in the parlor, the children on the floor at their parents' feet, little Thomas already nodding off in Josephine's lap. "Tell us how you and Pa met," Elizabeth requested, her eyes bright in the lamplight. It was her favorite story, though she'd heard it countless times. Josephine exchanged a smile with Matthew. "Well," she began, "it all started when I arrived on a train without a letter." As she recounted their story edited appropriately for young ears, Josephine marveled at the twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. The desperate young woman who had stepped off that train in 1876 could never have imagined the life that awaited her, a life richer and more fulfilling than any she might have known in Boston or New York. Later that night, after the children were tucked into bed, Josephine sat at her writing desk and opened the current journal, the fourth in the series that had begun with that first leather-bound book Matthew had given her. She dipped her pen and wrote, "Today we learned that Mr. Simmons has finally faced justice for his schemes. I should feel vindicated, I suppose, but instead I find myself oddly grateful. Had he been honest, had I never boarded that train, I would never have found my way to Matthew, to this ranch, to the life that has become more precious to me than any I could have imagined for myself. The journal Matthew gave me that first day was meant to uncover my secrets, to determine if I was trustworthy. Instead, it became the foundation of our love story, a story still being written, day by day, year by year. Sometimes I read those early entries and hardly recognize the frightened, desperate young woman who penned them. She could not see then what seems so clear to me now, that sometimes our greatest blessings arrive in the most unexpected packages. Sometimes they arrive without a letter. She closed the journal and joined Matthew on the veranda, where they sat together in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge in the vast Colorado sky. His hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice and enduring love. "Happy?" he asked simply. Josephine squeezed his hand, her heart full as she gazed out at the ranch they had built together, their home, their legacy, their shared triumph over adversity. "Beyond anything I could have imagined," she answered truthfully. "And you?" Matthew's smile was answer enough, but he spoke the words anyway, words that had become a cherished ritual between them. "I'm exactly where I'm meant to be, with exactly who I'm meant to be with." And in that moment, as in countless moments before and countless yet to come, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the heart of the man beside her, the man who had once handed her a journal and asked her to tell him everything, never knowing that in doing so, he was opening the first page of their remarkable, improbable love story.